A panel of thinkers and decision makers led the discussion on whether racism should be criminalised. Many speakers agreed that there should be punishment for racist behaviour, but they raised concerns if it would be a viable solution to combat it in the long run. All these were discussed at Criminalising Racism Conference, organised by the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, the Canadian Embassy and the Institute for the Advancement of Journalism. Now, to look into the issue of racism closely, in our studio we are joined by Neeshan Balton, who's the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Very good morning to you, Neeshan. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning and thank you. Before
we go as to what the discussions were at the conference, of course, the very latest one now is the issue that we have at the Pretoria Girls' School, the march being planned there. The Panyaza Lesufi, the Gauteng MEC for Education, is expected to make an appearance there. How do you view this kind of incident or this kind of uproar at the school?
I think it's part of the ongoing areas of transformation that still needs to be focused on. Schools like this have developed a particular ethos and an understanding of what they describe as academic excellence. Included in their notion of excellence is dress and attire and language, and which does not conform to current-day South Africa and its practices. So in a sense, what you have here is an attempt to assimilate black students into a particular culture, and many would define it as white culture, and you're finding resistance to that today.
Yeah.
At a time when I think South Africans are at a point where they will not tolerate being told how they need to dress and how they need to speak, but would accept that there are norms and standards that need to be adhered to. It's those norms and standards that I think that are under scrutiny in the school. And that it has come to a point where learners feel that they are victimized and discriminated because of their language and their dress is a very serious issue. What it does point to is that our schools do need a national approach on how to deal with racism. We do need a national policy on racism or anti-racism for schools. And that is something that we have raised with the Department of Basic Education almost a year ago. We have put forward to them drafts around what such a policy could in fact entail. And it's something that we will be putting forward to the Gauteng MEC as well.
Now, at the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, fighting racism is one of the things that you really focus on. Why is this fight against racism, do you think? Why is it so critical for you, but also so critical for South Africa right now?
Given where we come from, racism is entrenched in the DNA of this country. Whilst we might have gotten rid of the legislative part of that racism, the material, the psychological, the behavioral aspects of much of that apartheid racism prevails today. And that is why we need to do much, much more to eradicate it, and eradicate it very, very fast, particularly from public spaces such as our schools and universities and playing fields as well.
Now, we're asking our viewers the question, of course, today on screen. It's, should we criminalise racism in South Africa? You've just had the conference. Tell us about the outcomes of the conference and then give us your view on this question.
I think the seminar agreed that racism must be dealt with, that there should be no space for racists in South Africa. Racism must be something that we do not tolerate. Where there were differences of opinion is what form punishment should take for people who are in fact found guilty of racism. So you have an approach by the Human Rights Commission, for example, where you would have community service, where people who are found guilty or who admit to being racist would have to undergo community service as such. Then you have other instances where people have gone to the Equality Court and have been given fines. I think we're looking at this seminar, what kind of sanction actually gets a racist to acknowledge their wrongdoing and ultimately commit to changing their form of behavior and attitude. There is a strong view that in the current legislative work that is being done by the Department of Justice, looking at hate speech in particular, whether racism should not be added to that body of what is termed hate speech. Judge Mwepe, I think, pointed out that once we go down that road, it's very, you can entangle the legal fraternity in a minefield of work which is not very easy to define.
He also spoke at the conference about the threat to national unity.
I think the judge was pointing out that unless we collectively as a country deal with issues of racism, it can threaten the very fabric of our society. Now, if you look at the school issue, for example, it is going to polarize people in this country as much as Penny Sparrow and all others have done. And that's simply because we tend to deal with racism on an issue-by-issue basis, and which is why we're very happy that the Department of Justice is underway to finalize the National Action Plan to combat racism, because that will give us the broad-ranging set of tools and framework to now start dealing with racism in all its different manifestations.
Racism in general, all of us in South Africa, do we have a problem with perception when it comes to racism?
Very much so. You know, the attitudes and prejudices are still very much ingrained with us. We've only had 22 years of democracy. The effects of living in group areas and living in Bantustans and living separately is still very much part of us today.
Yeah.
And it's going to take much, much more to overcome those social divisions and social barriers. But it requires work. It requires work in our schools, in our places of worship, in our places of work. And ultimately, it requires ongoing investigations into what are the best tools and remedies to deal with those who are outwardly racist, and how do we condemn that, and what forms of punishment and sanction must be meted out.
The solutions going forward, what did the conference put forward? What are the solutions for South Africa, short, medium and long term, if one can put it like that?
One is firstly acknowledging that this is a huge problem. I was recently at the FW, the Clerk conference on Friday. And at this conference, basically, one of the key conclusions there was that racism is not a huge problem in this country. Now, if you look at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in their study, racism is a huge problem coupled with social attitudes which further divides people in South Africa. So that's the first thing, acknowledging this is a problem. Secondly, looking at the root causes of racism and racist behavior, which are linked to issues of inequality, issues of separateness in South Africa. And that requires a comprehensive program to tackle. Part of that comprehensive attempt to tackle it is in a national action plan which is underway. Secondly, it does require that we look
You're talking about social cohesion.
Well, more than social cohesion. It's also social action. Social action to overcome these divisions and to tackle it. In the anti-racism network, we say that there are 4 basic things that we need to do. We need to learn about racism. We need to talk about it. We need to speak out against it when it occurs. And we need to act against it where and when we find it, in our individual spaces as well as our public spaces. We think if those 4 things becomes the way in which all South Africans respond to racism, then we're not only dealing with it at an individual level, but also at the institutional level, where in which much of the racism that South Africans experience is coming to the fore. This school is an example of institutionalized racism and what needs to be done to tackle it.
Criminalising it, it might be tough, as some people might say. Even the speakers at the conference agreed that something needs to be done, but they varied or differed in their opinion as to what. Criminalising it, would that be the first step?
No, I actually think that my personal view is that we're going to find it very difficult to criminalize unless we're talking about racism that transcends into hate speech.
Yeah.
There, I think that the criminalizing it will become very, very, very easy. There are current court cases before the equality courts and so forth have paved the way in that regard. But where it becomes attitudinal racism, it's going to be very difficult to prosecute and to convict. But the fact that we're having this discussion nationally, I think, is very important, because through this discussion, I think we'll begin to draw the lines about what it is that we ultimately won't tolerate and what is it that we think we can tolerate and deal with and hopefully rehabilitate people who have those particular views. So we'll draw the lines in terms of how far we can go and what we can tolerate as a society. It's an important discussion. I think that it's not yet conclusive. The process of discussion itself will throw out the range of possibilities on how to deal with it in terms of criminalising.
Neeshan, thank you very much for joining us today. That's the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation here in South Africa, Neeshan Balton. We're talking about the question of the day. And let's put that question on the screen one more time for you. If you've just joined us, we're asking the question, should racism be criminalised in South Africa? Now, with our history, some would say that it should be a no-brainer, but there are many different aspects and different scenarios that needs to be considered. At SABC Newsroom is where you can send us our views.